Introduced in 1990 along with its 1100 big brother, in the wake of its previous models, the GPZ600R and the GPX600R, is the ZZR 600. When this bike was introduced, the 600 class was by far the most competitive in the UK and arguably the world markets, with all manufacturers having entrance in it. Even at one point, the reborn Triumph concern under John Bloor had a TT600, though it wasn't as successful. When introduced, the bikes were mainly still aimed at a all-purpose sort of market. So you had Honda's CBR, the ZZR, and the Kawasaki ZZR Teapot, the 600, which were general all-purpose bikes. The only one which was more focused was the Yamaha FZ, or it might have been FZR by that time, 600, which was always more of a pure sports machine. Anyway, what it occurred in the end is that bike was actually pointing the way to the way the market would actually go. It wouldn't be too long after this where the customers started moving away from this style of 600 more into the pure sports bikes. So you had the introduction of models like the GSX-R 600, the Yamaha R6, and that sort of thing. Even the Honda CBR grew an RR variant, which was a more pure sports. Kawasaki's response to this was to introduce a second 600 model into their range, the ZX6R, which is again more pure sports orientated. The early 1990 to 93 ZZR 600s were the D model. Looked pretty much identical to these, but were an entirely different bike, so much so that there's not a lot of parts which are interchangeable. This is a 1999 E model. The E's came out in 93 and continued all the way through to about 2007, when the last few examples are sold through UK dealerships at a discounted price, giving the whole model a 17-year model life. These bikes were sold as phenomenal performers. Indeed, when introduced, both the D and E in their first model years were the fastest bikes in the class. The E model was the first bike to be recorded with 100 brake horsepower in its class, although that was at the crankshaft. It was closer to 89 at the back wheel. It was also, in an officially timed two-way run, the first 600 class bike to go past 160 mile an hour. I believe it's 161.25 miles an hour. Although, to be quite honest, in such a competitive class, it wasn't long before that was beaten. These machines, even now, are capable of some horrendous speeds, and in an off-road situation, I have seen about 160 mile an hour on the clock of this 23-year-old bike on a few occasions. Although, to be quite honest, you'd have to be a bit of a nutter to try and do it on the road. Build quality for its time was pretty good for a Kawasaki. The paint was quite thick and lasted quite well, though you can see my one, I have got the odd ding on it. And on the ZZR, especially this particular colour scheme, they used the pearlescent paint, which it looks absolutely fantastic, but it's a bugger to match if you do have to paint up bits of it yourself. These machines have often been described as sports tourers, but I think Kawasaki were going for a much more specific market with these, the market of the GT or Grand Touring bike. The idea is normally just you or a pillion, light luggage, travelling at very high speed on main roads, motorways and such like, and covering huge distances in one go. And for that purpose, they're very, very, very suitable. There's not many bikes that are better on a motorway over distance. What helps is they've got a very long wheelbase, and they are physically big machines. I heard some people say they're probably the biggest of the 600 class machines, but I'm not too sure. Certainly I've had this parked up next to like 1000cc bikes like Fireblades, and this bike is probably a little bit bigger than a Fireblade or an R1. Right. The engine, like I say, it's famously the first one to reach 100 brake horsepower. Maintenance on these is a bit more awkward than with some bikes. Oil filters at the front of the engine, but to get to it you have to get past the exhaust, and you have to move the oil cooler out of the way a little bit as well, often helps. To get at the spark plugs, you have to have the tank off, airbox out, and you have to move the ignition coils to get at them properly. But by far, the biggest butt ache maintenance wise of this bike is valve and shim adjustment. A particular hate of mine isn't so much bucket and shim valve adjustment, because I've had that before in things like Suzuki GS750s. It's bucket and shim valve adjustment with the shim underneath the bucket. So, bear in mind by now, the cylinder head of the bike is probably somewhere right down here. So you're working in a very confined space in the first place. By the time you got there and you got the rocker cover off and you checked your valve clearances, if any do need adjusting, the only answer is to take off the carburetors, just to get a bit more room to work. Cam chain tightener, tensioner has to come off. Then you have to take out the camshafts and make sure the chain doesn't drop down as well, just to change the shims. Now, a lot of manufacturers prefer shim over bucket, and I've heard all the arguments for why they do it the other way around, Kawasaki. As in, you need it on a high revving engine and all this. Right, I'm not convinced. Early GSXR 750s actually had thread and screw and lock nuts, I believe, valve adjustment. And the Kawasaki Z650, hardly a high revving bike, or was it the Z1000, again had shim under bucket. My own personal belief is that this is purely to increase trade going for the Kawasaki dealer workshops. It's almost deliberately designed to make it just a butt ache for home maintenance. That aside, it's the only really difficult job, besides putting the airbox back in. The only advice I'll give you with that, do not try and take the airbox out or put it back in one lump. Strip it down and reassemble it in the bike. The first time it might take you a while and a few skin knuckles, because you have to go over two parts at the front for the ram air system. But once you've done it a few times, you can get it down to about 20 minutes in and out. But again, not exactly fun. Brakes on these, standard for Takiko. On the E's, a single caliper, single piston item at the back, and two 4-pot calipers at the front. Now, a common modification on these machines with owners is to replace these for Nissan brake calipers from a Honda. And the reason for this is basically down to manufacturing. Well, from what I've been told anyway. When they manufacture Takiko brakes, they'll make the bits, then they'll anodise them, but then they'll do the final drilling on the bore for the pistons, which means that you now have bare metal in there, which means it corrodes a lot easier. So these brakes are a lot more prone to corrosion over the winter period. Nissans, on the other hand, from what I've been led to believe, actually have an allowance built in, so they machine them, bore them out for pistons and then anodise them, so there's less bare metal to actually corrode. Right, my own thoughts on brakes is, as long as you look after the ones you've got, I mean, I've had this bike now for 8 years, the standard brakes, if they're looked after, are more than powerful enough to do the job. They're progressive, they've got a nice firm lever feel, and they're fine. However, I'm a kind of rider who very rarely has to brake hard. I'm not a hard accelerating, hard braking kind of rider. And if it is your riding style, I have heard it said that the Nissans are possibly a better bet with more actual brake performance. You pay your money, you take your choices. But if you're just doing normal riding and you're prepared to look after them, there's nothing at all wrong with the Takiko brake calipers themselves. Handling. Like I say, these are designed principally to cover large distances on big main roads. So you've got quite a long wheelbase there. It's got quite a steep rake angle at the front end. So it means you're not going to have the kind of sports bike handling you get with a Fireblade or an R1 where you can just go steaming in, just tip it over or flick it into the corner. These, like an old British bike, need to be set up for the bend and lined up for it first. I've just had some company from my cat, so the only issue you're going to find with handling, or two issues, is the one I've just covered. If you try and treat this like a sports bike, at some point it's going to kick you in the butt, okay? It will not do fast changes mid-corner. And if you try and do a flick through a series of bends in different directions, there's a good chance you will tighten a knot. One of the things, I don't know if you can see just looking at this picture here, it's got a very, very pronounced, almost like a downward wedge shape. These machines tend to carry more weight on the front end than the ideal 50-50 weight balance between wheels. I'm guessing it's carrying about somewhere between 60 and 70% of its weight on that front end. This is to essentially remove the feeling of the steering going light at high speed on motorways. And it's fine, but it does work. But if you're doing slow speed turns on wet or slippery roads, it does give you that feeling that it's trying to wash out all the time, and the front wheel feels like it's trying to just slide out of the way. You just have to be really careful of that. Because of that, the one thing you should always budget for on one of these is having a decent set, and I'd recommend sports tourers, of tyres on it. Okay, try using a front touring tyre, which I've done in the past, and it's actually quite easy to lose that front end on slimy roads at slow speed. Right. Moving on, if you're buying one, what faults are we talking about with these machines? The biggest thing that seems to crop up in forums is if you leave them standing for any length of time and they just won't start for some peculiar reason. I think the carbs on these are very sensitive to being neglected, even for short periods of time. So I've had this machine now for 8 years. Even when I haven't been using it, I start it up religiously once a week and run it right up to temperature. Okay, it has never ever failed to start on me. But like I say, if you leave it at any length of time, be aware that you may have problems with it. Right. Another issue that's happened a lot lately, and it even got me a few weeks ago, is we seem to be having a spate of rectifier regulator faults with these. On mine, unfortunately I was doing a few miles at a time, it managed to burn out not just the starter motor solenoid and the rectifier regulator and the battery, but all the wiring into them. A good thing now, you can get these cheaply from eBay. I think anything from £5 upwards. There's units like this. It's right into your bike's electrics. It tells you how much voltage is reaching the battery. Anything more than 14.69 volts and you've got a problem. And I'd really recommend changing it before it takes out half the rest of the wiring in your bike as well. There's loads of cheap replacement parts available on eBay for about £20. I did try one, but as soon as I put it in the bike and the first time I started it up, I was still showing about 20 volts getting through and it's getting worn to the touch within 30 seconds, so I sent that back and got my money back. The standard Kawasaki ones, if you can find one these days, are coming in at about 130 quid I think on average. Some a bit more, some a bit less. But the one fitted here is from a company called Electric. It's a British company, manufactured in this country, very well manufactured. It actually looks better quality than the standard Kawasaki one, and available for around £60–70. I got mine through a company called Remoto. Highly recommended and should last for years. Another thing that's been happening seems to be a spate of breakages of this bracket here that hold the back of the train guard on. I don't know if you can see this, if I can get this around a bit more. You see it on mine, I've bodged it by making the secondary like bracket using a bit of stainless bar here. You can either fix it how I've done it, but of course the proper way to fix it would be to take the whole swing arm off and alley weld it. But what I've done works, it's solid enough, so but keep an eye on that, okay? Make sure your chain, if you're looking to buy one, make sure the chain guide isn't flapping around. Exhausts on these, like most bikes of its time, were mild steel, and they all rot through so quick you wouldn't believe it. If you've got a Watson exhaust and you want to buy one, knock the seller down and budget somewhere between £200 and £300 for a full stainless steel exhaust from somebody like Black Widow or Delkovic. I'd recommend going for the full 4x2 system, purely because I've heard a lot of talk about 4x1s exaggerating a natural flat spot they seem to have in top gear at about 5,000 RPM. Probably put there by Kawasaki for emissions tests or such like. As a pure note on the aside on this flat spot, you'll find it doing a top speed run on these almost impossible to reach top speed if you do it just in top gear. You'll hit the flat spot and you won't get the engine much past 130, 140. You really have to start from third gear onwards and really give it the beans to the red line all the way from that third gear to get a top speed run out of these. The last big issue is the famous second gear problem. Now, Kawasaki use a system on these where if it's standing still the bike, you can only select neutral and first gear, or you should only be able to do that anyway. But there's some talk that if you then go and keep on doing hard acceleration in first and second gears and you're moving, that combined with the system can knock out second gear on some of these machines. So if you are buying one of these bikes, you're really going to want a test ride. You need to make sure that second gear is there, it's working, it's not jumping out of it or anything similar. If it is playing up second gear, it's either a replacement engine or you've got to strip down the engine and find the bits to fix it. I'd be tempted just to walk away, to be quite honest. If you are buying one of these bikes though, there's one big plus point I can say about them. That is, given their performance, their comfort, their speed, their ability to cover huge mileages, they are still almost unbelievably cheap. I looked on eBay before I did this video and there was at least 3 there looking to be in good nick for less than £1,000. Okay, if you really want a reliable bike to do the mileage on, then you really can't do much better than these. Right. Thanks again for watching. I'll see you again in another week, and until then, ride safely. Thanks, bye.